So now, Jesse.
There's a little bit of a calibration issue with the screen, which it looks like will be resolved. So I'll just start. I'm going to talk about experimental philosophy of free will, but it occurred to me that the concept of experimental philosophy may not be familiar to everyone, so I wanted to say a little bit about experimental philosophy in general. And if you think about philosophy, there are two kinds of philosophers we tend to see, and they're, I think, on display in this conference. Some philosophers tend to work from first principles using what is sometimes, I think, denigrated unfairly as armchair reflection. That is, they're trying to arrive at theories without the aid of empirical or experimental evidence. And there are other philosophers whose work is deeply informed by and responsive to work that's coming out of the empirical sciences, neuroscience, psychology, anthropology, and so on. And some time ago, I introduced the term empirical philosophy to refer to philosophers who regularly call on empirical results, findings from the sciences in order to support their theories. And people in this room, like Paul and Dan, Pat in this room, Pat is not in this room, have been really pioneers in encouraging the next generations of philosophers to do this quite regularly. But with the exception of Paul's explorations of the color after images that he mentioned, members of this group, the group that were my teachers, didn't regularly conduct experiments themselves. They relied on the experiments that were being done by people trained in experimental techniques. And in about maybe 15 years ago, a trend started of philosophers starting to do experiments themselves. So if you think about Aristotle as a philosopher who always tried to remain very informed by the observational sciences of his day, and Plato as somebody who tried to do philosophy from the armchair, we can now think of a generation of philosophers that are trying to get into the labs and do some of this research themselves. And that's what the experimental philosophy movement has been all about. And it's raised a lot of questions about what are the appropriate methodologies for philosophy. It's worth mentioning, of course, that the use of experimental methods by philosophers is not new. And in fact, Aristotle himself was a great contributor to observational sciences. And the term experimental philosophy has actually been part of our vocabulary for many centuries. This is a book from the 18th century using that term. But in the 15-year recent history, there's been a kind of explosion of interest, and some new methodologies have appeared. And one of the things that's characteristic of experimental philosophy as it appeared 15 years ago is the initial strategies were to take philosophical thought experiments and survey people who are not trained in philosophy, typically undergraduates at universities, and ask them, what are your views, what are your opinions about these philosophical thought experiments? So I want to give you a couple of examples of what this kind of work might look like. So Sean Nichols, who's a dear friend and a wonderful philosopher, was a pioneer in the area, and he got interested in a number of things in moral philosophy. And one thing he wanted to know is, are people objectivists or are they relativists? And I won't read through this, it's too much text, but basically he asked people a question about a moral debate between two people, one of whom thinks that it's okay to harm someone or hit someone just because just because you enjoy it. You enjoy hitting people. And another person says, no, it's not okay to just hit people. This is the vignette that they read. A vignette is just a bit of text describing some opinion or scenario. And then they're given a question about this text. Is it best to say that one of these two people in the argument is right? So one person says it's okay to hit people. Another person says it's not okay to hit people. So you can pick one side or the other side. And then the third option is to say there's no fact of the matter. Both of them have equal, in a moral debate, both parties have equal claim to truth. So the poll is designed to see whether people tend to give that third answer, that in a moral dispute both answers are equally legitimate, or they think there's a single fact of the matter. If they think there's a single fact of the matter, they're objectivists. If they think there's no fact of the matter, they're relativists. And as a comparison condition, Sean gave a scientific debate. So he wanted to know, is the attitude towards debates in science the same as the attitudes towards debates in morality? And this, just to give you some technical terms for those of you who don't have training in social science, the vignette is called the dependent variable. Dependent means it's the variable that depends on the psychologist, or in this case the philosopher, to manipulate it. So the philosopher here is changing that vignette. It's not the participant in the study that's making any decision here. That's out of the participant's control. It's dependent on the experimenter's control. The questions are the independent variable. Independent variable is just the technical term for what your participants in the study will answer, the bit that they have control over. It's independent of what you decide. That's what you're trying to test. And the basic finding in these results, sorry about cutting off at the bottom of the screen, is that, first of all, people are much more relativistic about about morality than about science. So that's sort of already interesting. Are people objectivist about science? Yes, they tend to be. Are they objectivist about morality? Less so than about science. But another finding is that people's tendency towards relativism is sort of 50-50. Half of them are relativists, half of the respondents are objectivists. So there's just a split in the population about whether people are relativists or not, and then a question is what implications follow. I'm just going to give another example of a study here. So there's been a lot of interest in an old thought experiment in moral philosophy about dilemmas of life and death. So a train is speeding towards 5 people. You have an opportunity to divert the train onto another path. And if you do, it will kill 1 person instead of 5. So if you pull this lever, the runaway, it's a trolley or a train, will hit 1 person instead of 5. So how many of you think it's permissible to pull that lever, saving 5 lives, killing one person? Is this morally okay to, if the train is heading towards 5, can you turn the lever and let it kill 1 instead of 5? Raise your hand if you think this is morally permissible. Okay? Okay, now a contrast scenario. The train is heading towards 5 people, and now you have an opportunity to stop it, not by pulling a lever, but by pushing this guy into the trolley's path. The guy will die, 5 people will be saved. So how many people think this is permissible? Raise your hand. So a few of you, but fewer. So basically, experimental methods have been used to try and see how these intuitions fall out. What percentage of people think these different scenarios are permissible? And experimentalists, this is work from John Mikhail and Mark Hauser, have devised a variety of different variations of these thought experiments drawn from the philosophical literature to show there's a tremendous variation in intuitions, even if the life-death ratio, saving 5 by causing the death of 1 or allowing the death of 1, even though these scenarios have the same numerical features, people's intuitions vary. And those variations can then be used to try and figure out what's driving the difference. There are philosophical theories of this, like the doctrine of double effect, which I won't describe for you. And experimentalists have tried to see, is that what's going on in people's head, this philosophical principle, when they make these decisions? So clever experimentalists have found ways to pit different philosophical theories of this difference into an experimental context against each other and decide which theory best characterizes how people actually make these judgments. Now, there are lots and lots of worries. The experimental philosophy has started a huge literature about philosophical methodology. And there are many people who reject experimental philosophy. Some people think it's a return to something that a lot of philosophers have moved beyond. So a lot of philosophers like Paul, who are doing very scientifically informed philosophy, really stopped doing this kind of work that depended on thought experiments. They said, let's observe how the mind actually works. Who cares about thought experiments? And experimental philosophy brings philosophy back to thought experiments because those are the primary items that are used in these vignettes. So some people see it as a step backwards. Some people worry that it's getting at folk intuitions. It's helping us learn what ordinary people think, which might be interesting, but it's getting us further away from understanding the underlying processes. We're not understanding how the mind works, we're just understanding folk beliefs about how the mind works or how morality goes and so on. Another complaint is that experimental philosophy basically uses untrained undergraduates as their subject pool, as opposed to philosophical experts who have thought long, deep, and hard about these issues. And the idea that we can learn philosophical truths from people with absolutely no training in philosophy, as opposed to the experts people see as a kind of absurd methodology. We wouldn't couldn't do ordinary science by just asking a bunch of people on the street what they think about physics. Do you have phone reception?
Let's find out if our little camp got sold.
That's impressive. And finally, or penultimately, another complaint is that a lot of people say, oh, well, we knew this already. So you take the trolley problems, and experimentalists say, oh, we've discovered that most people think it's, wow. Most people with the trolley problem say it's okay to pull the lever, but it's not okay to push somebody into a trolley's path. But that's exactly what philosophers had been saying all along. So by doing the survey, we don't seem to learn much. And another complaint is that a lot of this is just bad psychology. So trusting philosophers to do psychological experiments is about as good as trusting psychologists to do philosophy. Some of them might do it well, but if they do, it's a big surprise to everyone. And just on this score, giving you a little bit more about what that means to call it bad psychology. In psychology, a distinction is made between a survey, like how many people are in favor of capital punishment. That's a survey. It's a poll of opinions, and an experiment. In an experiment, as opposed to an opinion poll, there's what's called a manipulation. You do something to alter somebody's psychological state and see what that alteration does. You're trying to, if you want to get at processes, you want to show how changing a process changes a behavior. And a typical opinion poll, like are you in favor of the conservative candidate or the liberal candidate, that doesn't alter your thinking. It tests your thinking as it currently is. So it's a very bad way at getting at psychological processes. But clever experimental philosophers find ways to use surveys as manipulations. That is, by altering something in the survey, they can compare two conditions where people read the same survey with some manipulation, some change that might alter how they think. To give you an example of this, this is from I now actually run a lab, so I have a lab with weekly lab meetings, and we do a lot of experimental work, and my students do a lot of experimental work. And one of the domains in which we work is aesthetics, and also in moral philosophy. And we're interested, for example, in how people make aesthetic judgments. And so an example, you won't be able to read this, but you're asked to assess how beautiful this painting is. Okay, so, and you're given some information about the artist. And here, what you learn is that this painting was made by an artist who was a Holocaust rescuer. So this is made by somebody who saved a number of people during the Holocaust. And you're told that fact about the artist, and you're asked how beautiful it is, the painting. We have a whole bunch of questions, I think 12 questions in this study we ask about the painting. Now, that's what some participants get. But other participants get a neutral condition where they're told this is just a kind of ordinary person. And a third group gets the truth. This is a painting by Adolf Hitler. And basically what we're interested in is whether this moral fact, this moral difference about the artist, alters our perception. So some people can't listen to Wagner because they know Wagner was a terrible anti-Semite and fascist. So that kind of idea that the art gets tarnished by its moral dimension is something that we were exploring here. By manipulating people's beliefs about the artist, we were putting them in different psychological states and measuring the effect of that on a seemingly unrelated task, an aesthetic task. And you can see the beauty judgments are affected. Here are some of our other dependent variables, and you can see the badness versus goodness of the artist has an impact, a predictable impact on every item that we looked at. Now, a lot of experimental philosophy is coming of age. It's maturing. The philosophers doing it are getting training in psychology, and their techniques are getting more varied and more sophisticated to the point where they can claim they're not doing bad psychology anymore, but are actually doing psychology that psychologists would respect. And the best of them are publishing their work in psych journals, in the top psych journals. So if we get to a point where we get, just as we have someone like Nick here, who's a trained scientist, who's doing a lot of work that's extremely philosophical, that's as relevant and rich and philosophically sophisticated as anyone else in this boat who's trained in philosophy, we're getting a lot of philosophers who are getting trained in psychology. So this is a study. We got interested in moving beyond surveys, and we wanted to, I don't have this, we wanted to induce emotions. To see the effect of emotion on moral judgment. So we did that using Japanese noise music. And I'm going to play you something that this is music. It's something people listen to recreationally. But in the laboratory, if you're listening to this in headphones, it has an emotional effect. Okay, that goes on for about 18 minutes. If anyone wants the artist information, it's a band called Masana, and it's a, go out and buy the CD. I'm sure all of you are rushing to buy that and put it on your iPods. But so anyway, a lot of people find this very irritating. And what we show is that after playing irritating music, people make harsher judgments about morality. And in other work, we've induced other emotions. That's a kind of anger or irritation emotion. We've also induced disgust. I won't play you that sound because it's the sound of vomiting. And we've induced happiness and a number of other emotions, sadness. And we've looked at the effect on moral judgment. And what you can find is that, first of all, emotions influence our moral judgments, but in different ways. Different emotions influence different moral judgments. So judgments about the body are affected by disgust. Judgments about things like justice or rights are affected by anger, but not conversely. So this is one way in which you can start doing something more like a traditional psych experiment, where it's not just paper and pencil survey, but you're actually altering somebody's psychological state, in this case through sound. Experimental philosophy has a number of uses. A lot of philosophers speak in the first person plural, which is to say there are a lot of pronouncements throughout philosophical work that says it is obvious that, it is intuitively obvious that. And the implied statement is to us. To us meaning everyone, all ordinary human beings. Anyone who's thinking about this would find this intuitively obvious. But is that actually true? So experiments can test whether these philosophical intuitions are shared. You can test that by looking at whether they're shared across cultures, which is something that philosophy is often done by a single culture. I mean, can we show, for example, that, say, Russians and people in Western Europe and the United States have the same philosophical intuitions? Or are these intuitions a function of our cultural history, of the philosophical training we get? Experiments can lead to surprises. I won't go through some examples here, but there are some wonderful ones in the literature where in doing experiments you hit on something you didn't expect. I've had this in my own lab work where things that were actually contrary to my prediction occurred, and they've turned out to be incredibly interesting and important leads.
Give us one.
So one example is I was looking for self-serving bias in the moral domain. So it turns out that there's huge literature that people basically do things that service themselves. They see themselves as more competent, better in every way than they see other people. And they do a lot of things that are self-serving in this way. So we gave people a first person and a third person variation of the same moral vignette. So either imagine that somebody steals something. How bad is that person? And now imagine that you steal something. How bad are you? And we expected that people would be easier on themselves than they are on others. But in the moral domain, they're actually harder on themselves than they are on others. And a possible explanation of this is that it's actually a consequence of this self-serving bias, that because you see yourself as so good and so morally upstanding, you can't imagine you would do this horrible thing. So it's led to some new sort of a surprising reversal effect that comes out of self-serving bias, things like that. Some work has looked at what you might call robust inconsistencies. So ordinary people sometimes make inconsistent judgments, like, is it okay to push somebody in front of trolley path? No. Can you pull the lever? Yes. Some of these people make judgments that are inconsistent even when they're faced with the very same vignette. So the very same subject sees both vignettes, like all of you, and they still make these seemingly contradictory judgments. Experiments can probe how robust those inconsistencies are. Do they continue to hold up as you give more details, more cases, more variations? And some of them turn out to prove incredibly robust. So there's some very influential work by Joshua Knobe on what's called the side effect, showing a very surprising asymmetry that occurs in the context of attribution of intentions. And I won't review that work, but experiments have really helped establish that this isn't just an accident. It's not what linguists call a performance error, where people just make a mistaken judgment. It's really a deep part of their understanding of how intentions work. And I think experimental philosophy can also get at underlying processes. And so I think the example of showing that, say, moral judgment is affecting an aesthetic judgment might point, it's not demonstrative evidence, but it might point to a kind of non-modularity, that moral information might be entering into, in this case, perceptual or aesthetic evaluative information. So it leads to further studies where we can look at how that interaction works. Is it that people see the picture differently when they know that it's done by Hitler? Or is it that they see it exactly the same way, but they don't want to now call it beautiful because they have a negative view of Hitler? The study suggests that something is going on there, and further work can see how that interaction works. And finally, psychologists don't do the studies that we philosophers want. You're often frustrated that you want to test a philosophical theory, and a psychologist hasn't done it because they're not interested in our philosophical theories. So I think one use for XFI is just trying to get into work that we as philosophers might find interesting. So I'll end with some examples of that in the free will debate. So philosophers have been extremely interested in free will. Psychologists to some extent, but less so. And a lot of the philosophical issues about free will, like the status of compatibilism, have not been of particular interest to psychologists. So philosophers have been motivated to try and do some experimental work here. So I'm going to give you some examples. The first one comes from Woolfolk, Doris, and Darley. Two of them are psychologists. One of them, John Doris, is a philosopher. And they got interested in what are called Frankfort cases. So do people in this room know what Frankfort cases are? They're basically cases where you cannot do otherwise, but the action you do is consistent with what you had wanted to do. And the end question is, are you responsible when you can't do are you ever responsible when you can't do otherwise? So they design a vignette about hijacking. So you're on a plane that gets hijacked, or a character named John is on a plane that gets hijacked, and or Jim, I think, and he's asked to kill someone. So the hijackers put a gun to his head and say, you have to kill this guy, Frank. So Bill has to kill Frank. That's the scenario. Now, psychologists need independent variables. They need something they manipulate in order to show a comparison between two conditions. So in this case, there are two independent variables. It's called a 2x2 design. One is the degree of constraint. That is the person with the gun to his head really in danger? So if the one view, the gun is loaded, he has no way out, is the gun pointing straight at his head. If he doesn't kill Frank, he's going to die. It's guaranteed. In the other, the hijackers are kind of lazy, and their guns aren't really loaded, and they're not really paying attention, and they say, yeah, we want you to kill Frank, but Bill knows he could get away with not doing it. He knows there's a good chance he could run away and escape from the hijackers, or overpower the hijackers and not kill Frank. The other thing they manipulate is the degree of identification. In one scenario, Bill really likes Frank. He doesn't want him to die. In the other, Bill hates Frank. Frank, it turns out, has been sleeping with his wife, and he's violently jealous at Frank, and he's been planning to kill Frank anyway. So he says, great, what a wonderful opportunity. I can now kill Frank. I can pretend that I was forced to by the hijackers. But of course, in the high constraint condition, he has to. He has no other choice. And the dependent variables include, was Bill responsible for killing Frank? And they're given a scale. On a scale of 1 to 7, is Bill responsible? On the left, you can see with moderate constraint, basically, the gray line means it's not the identification condition. This is a case where somebody doesn't want to kill Frank. And the white line is somebody who wants to kill Frank. So when Bill wants to kill Frank, he is considered, so think about 4 as sort of the midpoint on this scale. Let's go with the first bar starting from the left. So this is a case where Bill doesn't want to kill Frank, and he's under moderate control. That is, he could get away with not killing Frank, but he does it anyway. Is he responsible? Sort of 50-50. A little bit responsible because he could have gotten away with not doing it. But then again, they do have guns, and it is a dangerous situation. So he gets some level of responsibility. But just it's sort of, they're not quite sure whether he's responsible here. If you compare the next dark line over, under the high constraint condition, here's a case where he doesn't want to kill Frank, but he has no choice. And you can see that bar moves down a little bit. So here they're more reluctant to attribute responsibility. And then in the white lines, both of those white lines show cases where he identifies with this goal. He really wants to kill Frank. And the most interesting line in the bar for confirming Frankfurt intuitions is the rightmost line. That bar on the right shows that here's a case where Frank cannot do otherwise. He's absolutely forced. Is he responsible? And you can see it edges just above that midline there. So people are willing to attribute above a medium degree of responsibility, just marginally, to somebody simply in virtue of the fact that they've identified with this action that they can't control. So a close reflection on these data, trying to look at other manipulations of them, might help us get at the heart of where these Frankfurt-style intuitions are coming from. That's not a great example because it falls prey to the "we knew this already" objection. In a way, it's a confirmation of those Frankfurt intuitions. It's useful to confirm those intuitions because philosophers are subject to bias, but it doesn't give us anything really new. So I'm going to show you a couple of studies that I think do give us something that was more surprising. Sean Nichols, Josh Knobe, and in some later work, Adina Roskies, had done a series of studies showing that people's attitudes towards compatibilism depend on the action. When it's a really bad action, people become compatibilists. When it's not such a bad action, they're incompatibilists. So there's a tension in people's answers here. And the setup, first the experimenters give people a description of two universes. One is a free will universe where there's libertarian free will. The other is a deterministic universe where absolutely everything is fully determined. The independent variable, the vignettes, describe either a bad action or a neutral action. So in some of these studies, the neutral action is like Jones on December 22nd ate a cheese sandwich at exactly 3:25 p.m. Was he responsible for this action? Or sometimes it's just a very generic question. In this universe, are people responsible for their actions? Sometimes it's a very bad action. So one of them says, Jones doesn't like his wife anymore because he's having an affair. So he goes into his home. He hacks her to bits with an axe. He then suffocates his two children. He lights the house on fire to make it look like an accident. Is he responsible for this action? So very different kinds of scenarios. And the dependent variable is Jones responsible or not? And the results show that people are compatibilists when it's a horrible action, but not otherwise. So this has raised a whole bunch of very interesting questions. Is compatibilism just a kind of wishful thinking? Do we become compatibilists under only those circumstances where we just really want to punish somebody? We're so disgusted by this action that we wish that the person could be held responsible because we really want them to suffer. A retributivist urge might underlie compatibilist intuitions. If so, intuitions about compatibilism might not be really robust. People might be basically incompatibilists, and compatibilism is just a kind of wishful thinking. So that's led to a wide set of follow-up research. Eddie Namias and his colleagues have done things looking at another differentiation. What if the cause of your behavior in a deterministic universe, so they imagined a deterministic universe, in this case it's the real world, scientists have discovered that our behavior is fully determined. But what if the cause is we're determined by our brains versus we're determined by our psychology? So all they manipulate is they say scientists have discovered our behavior is fully determined, but half of the participants hear that it's determined by the underlying brain mechanisms, and half hear that it's determined by the psychological states. A difference that shouldn't make a difference if you believe that psychology and biology are linked in some intimate way. And then the question is, are people free and responsible in these scenarios? And the results are people are much less compatibilist when the causes are neural. So if they're told your behavior is caused by your brain, people say, wow, I have no free will. And if they say your behavior is completely deterministically caused by psychological states, which are then caused by things outside of your mind, people say, oh, I still have free will. So mentioning biology seems to change people's intuitions here. There's been some follow-up work that's looked at this and some other things in more applied context. So Aspinwall looked at judges and showed that judges are extremely influenced by evidence having to do with biomechanisms, but not so much evidence from psychology. So if you bring a psychopath into the courtroom and you say, this person has been diagnosed using the psychopathy checklist, the diagnostic tool, as having a psychopath based on his psychological symptoms. Judges don't care. But if you say, here's a neuroimaging scan showing that this person's brain is a little different than the norm, judges suddenly care. So this asymmetry between biology and psychology, a kind of folk dualism, is entering into decision-making in the courtroom. This has not been replicated, but it's an intriguing direction. Vos and Schooler have shown that if you prime people with sentences about determinism, they're more likely to cheat. So actual behavior might be affected by your beliefs in free will. There's a very disturbing study by an Israeli group headed by Danziger who show that sentencing by judges gets harsher later in the day. And I'm going to show you this data because this is one of the scariest plots I've ever seen. So basically they're looking at So you can see on the axis there, it says proportion of favorable decisions. So the logic is that as judges go through the day, their nutrition goes down, they're more tired, they're less well fed, they're maybe just more irritable. And what you can see, the decisions get less and less favorable. So I think this is a measure of months served in jail. So you can have a dramatic increase in your sentence simply as a function of whether you were lucky enough to get a hearing early in the day or late in the day. So the underlying psychology and the emotions that are involved in attributions of responsibility have a real-world implication. I've been looking at this a little bit in another context, is sort of looking at whether globally, in a geopolitical way, compatibilism is the norm. And actually, there's something called the World Value Survey, where people across the globe in a couple of hundred countries have been asked a series of questions about their values. One of them is about free will. And roughly you're asked, do you believe in fate, or do you believe actions are free? And you can look at national averages. And it turns out that countries differ in their belief in fate or their belief that we're free. Some countries tend to think we're all free. A lot of countries, the norm, the average, is to believe in fate. So I got interested in the most fatalist countries and the most libertarian countries and their criminal justice systems. And it turns out the top most libertarian countries, so that's Canada at the top, Canada all the way down, Canada, Mexico, Australia, Norway, Sweden, South Korea. These are very libertarian countries. They believe in free will. They tend to not have capital punishment. 70% of them don't have capital punishment, looking at the top 10. And the ones that do have capital punishment, two of them only have it for murder. And the one exception is Vietnam, which is a weird outlier in this list for reasons I won't go into. The bottom 10, the most fatalist countries on the planet, have the opposite. 70% of them have capital punishment. And they have capital punishment for all kinds of crimes. You can get executed for doing all kinds of things, not just killing someone. So they're much more severe when it comes to punishment. There are only 3 exceptions. One of them is Rwanda, which only eliminated capital punishment so they could extradite war criminals and get them brought back to the country for trial. So basically what we see is that believing in fate doesn't mean you suddenly become more lenient about punishment. So going back to the debate between Dan and Dirk, just looking at the real world descriptively, it's not clear that people suddenly say, oh, well, we think actions are determined, therefore we're going to become more lenient in our punishment. The opposite seems to be true. So getting at an explanation for that would be intriguing. Okay, the upshot of all of this, what we've learned. So a bunch of questions are being asked by experimental philosophers. One of them is, are ordinary people compatibilists? And answers here depend on the study and the theorist, but at least there's some evidence that when the question is asked correctly, people tend not to be compatibilists. They're only compatibilists when they really want to punish somebody. What drives free will decisions? Are these motivated? So in these cases, we tend to find that people are much more likely to attribute free will when they really want to punish somebody. The same world can be described if the behavior is bad, the attributions of free will go up. What kinds of causes impact free will decisions? So things like national origin might be a factor here. There's some work on gender differences that's a factor here. Severity of the action, which we just looked at, is a factor here. These studies get at all kinds of very, very detailed answers to this question. How do beliefs about free will affect behavior? Things like the Boston Schooler study showing that people who are libertarian tend to cheat less might be a direction to explore this kind of question as well. And the courtroom studies also are behavioral in nature. What does this say about free will itself? So some people complain, who cares about folk intuitions or beliefs about free will? We want to know whether people really have free will. But I think, as any philosopher who's attended to this debate knows, a lot of the issues really are about our beliefs and value systems. They really are about our concepts. Compatibilism is a conceptual issue. It says that there's a concept, an important concept of freedom that continues to exist in a world where determinism is true. So trying to understand ordinary beliefs about this and how intuitions of compatibilism are formed bears directly on the traditional debate about what free will is. And finally, what's left to be done. And I really want to end on this note because I think it's important. Learning to do experiments is empowering. it's learning another tool. It's like learning how to do logic, or it's like learning about a philosophical debate, like the free will debate. Every time you acquire a new tool, you're empowered to do more things. And I think even for somebody who just wants to cite other people's scientific work, just getting in the process of trying to do experiments yourself gives you a much deeper understanding of how empirical research is done. But more importantly, I think philosophers are naturally very good experimentalists. An experiment is like an argument. What evidence would bear on this particular debate? So our skills are actually usefully deployed in an experimental application. So I think if all of us do the work of trying to devise experiments, it can be extremely rewarding. And I can assure you that for all of us who think that the way you write a paper is to sort of come up with the argument that's going to support your conclusion, it's very different psychology to try to come up with the experiment that will support your conclusion, because you're hostage to empirical data. And you sit there literally sometimes in front of, if you do it online, which I often do, you sit there watching your data come in and seeing how it will come out. And sometimes you're refuted, and sometimes you're confirmed, and sometimes you're surprised. So I'd like to suggest that in our casual conversations over remaining time together and in subsequent emails, we think about trying to collaborate on a study or maybe several studies. And I'd be happy to implement them using the resources I have and help people learn the techniques to do this and to do some of the simple forms of data analysis required once the data come in. So it's an invitation to engage in some collaborative experimental philosophy. Thank you all.
Questions from the students?
Could you explain once again the main difference between empirical philosophy and experimental philosophy? And could you explain your opinion about differences between psychological experiment, scientific experiment, and philosophical experiment?
Yeah, wonderful question. Very important question. And I wasn't clear on it. When I wrote a paper called Empirical Philosophy and Experimental Philosophy for something, a handbook that came out on experimental philosophy when this was just starting to become very popular. And at the time I was very skeptical of experimental philosophy because I thought most of the experiments philosophers were conducting were bad. And they were bad in the kinds of ways I was describing. They were mostly simple survey studies or opinion polls based on thought experiments, and they were getting at folk intuitions, but they, to me, were a step backwards. My own philosophical work and the work of many people I admired was looking at psychological processes and didn't care too much about folk intuition. So I thought, wow, why are we going back to these folk intuitions? Empirical philosophy was the name I chose for philosophers who try to answer philosophical questions by drawing on any experimental research, whether it's by neuroscientists or psychologists, any experimental work, including, by the way, work they've done themselves. So empirical just referred to any empirically informed philosophy. But a paradigm case would be someone like Paul or someone like Andy or Dan and others in this room. Experimental philosophy would, at the time, was just doing these vignette studies where you had a thought experiment and you looked at ordinary people's intuitions. I think now what's happened is that this very narrow notion of experimental philosophy, which is, so let me be more precise, you can define experimental philosophy as taking a philosophical thought experiment and simply giving it as a survey to people who are not trained in philosophy. Or it could be, some people do it with trained philosophers, but giving a survey version of a standard philosophical thought experiment. So instead of, so for instance, Edouard Macheret took Saul Kripke's thought experiments about direct reference, and he gave it to East Asians and to people in the US, and he found that people in the US had Kripke's intuitions about rigid designation and direct reference. People in East Asia tended not to. So that was, and it was designed to be critical of philosophy, to show that what we announce as universal philosophical theories might be more like social anthropology. They reveal attitudes prevalent in one culture that might not be shared universally. And that generated a very big debate. So that's a perfectly interesting and legitimate discovery, but to me it was still relying on these old thought experiments. With this new wave of experimentalists in philosophy, they're doing something more like traditional psychology, and that's why the second half of your question is so important. What's the difference? And I think there are two answers to that question. One is there's no difference, and that's a good thing. That is to say, if we've now, psychology emerged out of philosophy. So most early psychologists were trained in philosophy, and the questions they were doing were continuous with philosophy, and they just said, okay, this is a new method to answer philosophical questions. So if philosophers start to take on, think about the relationship between philosophy and logic. Logic was also created by philosophers, but it's developed as an independent field. But we don't say that when a philosopher does logic, it's not logic, or we don't say they're not doing true philosophy when they use logic. It's just you can have total overlap between these fields. So in one sense, it's just psychology. On the other hand, you could define empirical or experimental philosophy as using these results to address philosophical questions. So if somebody in psychology goes out and says, I'm going to measure the conductance speed of motor neurons, and they write this result. That's not philosophical. As presented, it doesn't bear on any philosophical question. A philosopher might do that study in order to support a philosophical conclusion, but on the face of it, that doesn't. So I think the difference between psychology and philosophy that uses psychology as a tool is that is in the questions that are being asked. And if you say, what is a philosophical question? I think that's a very hard thing to answer. But at least one answer is that a philosophical question is a kind of question that philosophers have been traditionally interested in. I don't think there's a sharp line between philosophical questions and other questions, but they tend to be grander questions about who we are and how we make decisions. I'm going to continue with student questions. Yeah.
Do you know about the discussion between Timothy Williamson and experimental philosophers about the value of philosophical education in discussing some problems, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, Tim Williamson has been one of the main opponents of experimental philosophy, and I think his reasons are varied. One thing he insists is that philosophy is not about collecting intuitions. So this idea that we settle philosophical theories by simply collecting a bunch of intuitions is, he thinks, a cartoon version of what philosophers actually do. And he thinks instead very drawn out deliberation and reflection, and then a kind of theory generation that's based on taking all of your reasons collectively and trying to develop a theory that best accounts for that is more accurate. And once you see philosophy as based on careful argumentation and reflection, the idea that it's simply about opinions or intuitions goes away, and the relevance of these poles becomes less interesting. I think the problem with someone like William, there's a lot to be said here, but someone like Williamson, I think, is being overly dichotomous about what we're doing in philosophy and what we're doing in psychology in two ways. And one is that it's one thing to argue that there are methods we can do better from the armchair than doing a survey study. That I think everyone would agree with. But it's another thing to say that these empirical methods can't bear on these debates. And I think we can show again and again that they do. They can be discovery heuristics. A surprising result can lead to new philosophical insights. They can show that a bit of philosophical reasoning has been biased by prior theory. They can be used to establish that a lot of philosophical, one question, a student of mine, Jeff Holtzman, gave a bunch of professional philosophers standard questions about philosophical issues. Are you a dualist? Do you believe in free will? All the kinds of things we're asking. And then he gave them a standard personality poll. Just the same instrument that's used in personality psychology. Are you neurotic? Are you conscientious? Are you extroverted? And he found beautiful correlations between philosophical beliefs and personality. So there's a way in which the presence of experimental philosophy can serve to constantly go back and check and make sure that philosophers are not subject to these kinds of biases. So as a safety check for philosophy. But I guess, to put it more polemically, I do think at the end of the day, what philosophy is exceptionally and ineliminably good at is developing theories. And I think if you didn't have a class of philosophers trying to pose questions, which is not an empirical activity, it's that's something you do from reflection. Empirical results can motivate a question, but sitting down and posing a question and then devising possible answers for those questions, as well as possible evidence for those different competing answers, that's a very philosophical activity. But once you've done that, and take Tim Williamson's theory. So Tim Williamson says that vagueness is a matter of epistemic limitations, that every predicate has a precise boundary, but we just don't know where the boundary is. That's a psychological posit. He's saying we're ignorant. He needs to explain why we're ignorant. And if he gives an explanation of why we're ignorant, that should be testable. To claim that a predicate could have a precise boundary is a claim about how language works. And that's a theory that he needs to put on the table, and that itself can be testable. So I've never seen a case in philosophy where a theory that is actually saying something hasn't ended up with an empirical set of predictions. And that's a trivial truth, because to say something, to be a substantive debate as opposed to just a totally arbitrary difference in how to describe the world, is to make a commitment to how the world is organized. And once you've done that, that can be tested through observational techniques.
And I have this one. Yeah. What's the difference between the methodology of thought experiments and experimental philosophy? Because Timothy Williamson doesn't see any principal differences between experimental philosophy and thought experiments, because thought experiments is just a kind of experimental philosophy.
Yeah, I think that's basically right. And one objection to experimental philosophy is that, well, in a way, whenever you conduct a thought experiment and present it to a community of philosophers, there's an opportunity to see if those intuitions are shared or not. So there is a way in which it's an observational method. But I think that's entirely true. Everything we do is observation. When you introspect, that's a kind of observation. That's a behavior you're observing. The use of statistics in experimental methods is a helpful addition, because you can start to see things like what percentage of people agree and what percentage of people disagree, but also you can start to move these intuitions around. And it's really with this possibility of manipulation. Jonathan Weinberg did a thought experiment where he took a standard philosophical thought experiment and presented it in two different orders, same sentences, but the order was reversed, and he got dramatically different results in intuitions. So I think ordinary thought experiments are are an observational or empirical method, but if we don't safeguard it using the kinds of things that are standard tools in psychology, look at who your population is, look at individual differences, manipulate people's intuitions by changes in presentation method, then you'll lose out on a lot of potentially informative information.
Yeah, well, then there is a question about thought experiments. It just seems to me that a lot of them are just impossible in our world, or they do not correlate and correspond with the scientific facts.
Yeah.
So is it important for them to be possible in our world and to correspond with science? Or every fantasy could be helpful? And so,
yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, there is a view in philosophy that says philosophers are interested in modal space, they're interested in possibility. Empirical science is interested in how things actually are. So the two are answering different kinds of questions. And I think that itself is based on a mistake, because if you say, first of all, you might be skeptical about modal claims, so I happen to be, but that's a much more complicated debate. But if you believe in modal claims, the way you arrive at modal claims is through something like conceptual truth. And what are concepts? I think concepts, if they're anything, have to be some kinds of psychological representations. There might be inferential associations that are formed in people's heads. So if you want to study modal facts, mere possibility, studying people's concepts is the appropriate thing to do. One way to do it is through armchair reflection, but you can equally study people's concepts using these kinds of experimental methods. So I do think that if you happen to be interested in mere possibility, experimental methods are still useful. But the other side of it, which is I think more at the heart of your question, is is there a danger that thought experiment methodology takes us too far from the actual world into the world of mere possibility? And I I tend to have that kind of anxiety myself. But I think there are two reasons why one needn't get too worried about that. And one is that a lot of thought experiments tell us about the actual world. If you think about the thought experiments done by physicists, for example, they're designed to try and characterize how things are here. And they're usually grounded in observations of how things are here. But I think philosophical thought experiments are also grounded in this way and are often designed to get at the actual world. But the other thing is, you might be just interested in mere possibilities as well. So I think when it comes to something like the debate about consciousness, it could be the case that if you could establish the mere possibility of a dissociation between conscious experiences and physical states, that might have implications for the metaphysics here. Whether it has that implication depends a little bit on issues in semantics that I think become quite complex quite quickly, which is to say, I think you could have a semantics on which a semantic possibility, a conceptual possibility, did not entail metaphysical possibility. You could have a view where metaphysical possibility simply is something like nomological possibility. So I think in philosophy there's a deep debate between whether metaphysical possibility should track conceptual possibility and whether metaphysical possibility should track nomological possibility. And correlatively, there's a deep debate about whether our concepts sort of reveal the structure of the world or float free from the structure of the world. I think you can show quite demonstrably that concepts float free from the structure of the world. Any reasonable account of how people acquire concepts, how they're learned, where they come from, how they vary, shows that these things are not beholden to reality in a way that might reveal the intrinsic structure of metaphysics by simple conceptual analysis. So I think that the place where your worry becomes a real danger is not so much when the people are worried about mere possibility. Who cares about mere possibility? If they're interested in that, and that can be very interesting, that's a perfectly legitimate exercise. The real danger is the people who are using mere possibility to describe actuality. And from my perspective, that often involves a false inference from a conceptual possibility to a metaphysical claim. Is that clear? Yeah. Can I come to the faculty side? Is that okay, Martina? Sorry to keep you.
I'm much more critical than you are skeptic about what we can learn from those surveys that are done in experimental philosophy. And I think the reason I can put in the following way. It is, of course, true that we are interested in conceptual issues in philosophy very often.
Yeah.
And it's also true, in my view, that those conceptual structures and insights we are interested in, that we can learn about them by intuition, because those conceptual structures manifest themselves in the intuitions that we have about cases. However, I believe that those concepts and conceptual relations we are interested in are often so complex and so much deeply incorporated in our thoughts that it's extremely difficult to come by with reliable intuitions, and you have to do a lot of work, of clarification work, before you can get to some intuitions that are really reflected and good enough to serve you as a philosopher. It can take years to develop your intuitive judgments, and years to develop the right distinctions that you must make in order not to be misguided. And so I don't think that intuition is something about quick judgment when you are presented with some of those examples. Those are not reliable at all. I mean, if you do more clarification with those people, then they will give different answers afterwards. So I think it's a wrong view about what intuitions are and what kind of intuitions are relevant to philosophy. And those quick answers, they don't help much.
I think it depends a lot on what we think intuitions are and what we're discovering with them. So Plato thought you do philosophy by this dialogical method. With after hours of debating with Socrates, something you knew sort of gets revealed. And I think a lot of analytic philosophy is a continuation of that idea. But in the 1960s, psychologists started studying concepts too. And they said philosophers are just dead wrong about them. Nobody has these these definitions hidden in their heads. How, after all, would they ever get there? Instead, what people have are prototypes and exemplars. The way people learn a language is by pointing to an instance and say, that's unfair, that's unjust, that's love. And then, from their observation of those examples, they construct a kind of a paradigm case, or maybe even just stored memories of a bunch of specific instances. When you start to study the structure of concepts using implicit methods, what you can find again and again is this kind of prototype structure. What's in our head is actually less, not more. We don't have rich, detailed definitions hidden away there that philosophical methods bring out. Rather, I think philosophical methods serve as a kind of theory construction. We try and do, it's like reflective equilibrium. We come up with the best definition that we would have to unify all the cases that we've stored. And I think there might be a lot of work and toil that comes in the process of trying to come up with a unifying account of our cases. But I think when we do that, we're not doing something like revealing conceptual structure. We're doing something like imposing structure that was never there. And I think a very interesting exercise that we haven't adequately engaged in and should is go through traditional philosophical debates and show, like there's this old book by Ryle on dilemmas that tries to take dilemma, but you can go through an old philosophical debate, like a kind of, this is an experimental version of the antinomy method, and show, look, these intuitions clash. Let's come up with an explanation for that clash. And one explanation might be coming from the prototypes, that because we don't have definitions, we have different kinds of paradigm cases, and they just split apart in these particular moments. So I think what philosophers owe us is an account of how possibly question. How possibly could we ever have ended up with these definitions in our head? Yeah.
I don't think that someone who believes in what I was just describing, that there are underlying conceptual structures that we can discover by engaging in intuitive judgment about cases and that stuff, is in any way committed to the claim that we have implicit definitions of those concepts in our stored in our mind. I don't think
so. What's the claim? What's the? In other words, if you're engaged in any sort of inquiry, you want to know what's my source of evidence. So what's the evidential basis for philosophy on your view?
Not all of it, but a lot of it is to get to the underlying structures by testing your own intuitions and asking other people.
Where are they? Are they in the head, or So to me, the fundamental question is, what are these so-called structures? I think they're psychological states. And because I think they're psychological states, I think it's vanishingly unlikely that they're anything like theories or definitions. I think they're more like stored collections of examples. But that's an empirical claim about the structure of concepts that could be mistaken. But if you don't even think that they're things in the head, then it's revelation. Then it's kind of journeys to Plato's heaven. So to avoid that cartoon, you need to tell us more. You need to say, what is it that we are getting at when we engage in this kind of reflective process?
Okay, I don't think I need to presuppose some psychological theory about concepts in order to say what I'm saying. But
okay, well, we can discuss more.
I'm going to refrain from asking the question I want to ask too, because I think we have to move on.
I'll ask. To be continued. Can I just remark on this debate here? This has really been enormously productive, and one of the things that experimental philosophy has done on all accounts is it's raised questions about philosophical methodology. And I think people who are skeptical about experimental philosophy have done an enormously good job of reflecting on and deepening our characterization of what philosophical methods consist in. It is, as I said, a 15-year-old activity, most of which has been bad. The idea that experimental philosophy has somehow served to refute or render irrelevant or even cast meaningful doubt on traditional methods would be an outrageous overstatement. What it's done is it's created a very robust and rewarding debate about what we're doing, and I think probably all parties agree, even us, that at the end of the day, if you're interested in a question, bring every methodology you can possibly bear into your purview and use those to answer that question. So traditional and experimental philosophy coexist. Thank you all.